talented scientists come to fervently believe that by experimenting on non-human animals, such as rodents, that they could ever gain insights into the complexities of the human mind. Since the beginning of recorded history, there have been attempts to understand the human mind and what causes people to behave as they do. By the late 19th century, great thinkers such as Freud had developed schools of thought about human nature using speculation, intuition, and the study of human experience. Freud and others like William James and Carl Jung developed complex schools of psychological thought which laid the foundation for much of 20th century psychology. They accomplished their pioneering work, as have most of the truly great thinkers in psychology, by clinical observation of human behavior. However, during the time of Freud, other psychologists began experimenting with non-human animals in order to study human behavior. Many scientists felt that psychology was a soft science and that it dealt with the intangible inner psyche of the human mind. In order to develop psychology into a so-called hard science like physiology, they needed hard data such as graphs, charts, and methods of experimentation. So began the field of comparative psychology, which is the study of animal behavior as it relates to the mind of man.
I think that assumption is really a false one, and I think psychology, since the Second World War at least, has jumped on the use of non-human animals in an attempt to be a more legitimate, if you will, hard science. Exactly. Borrowing the techniques and methodologies and experimental designs of the biologists, perhaps, or even of the physicists in some ways, saying, we have real data here, but those numbers, when they come out, they may not relate to anything. And my belief now is that I wasted a good many years, a lot of lives, a lot of suffering, for nothing. And I really feel that way about the totality of behavioral research. I think it's a agenda kind of thing. I think the people that do it most of the time believe in it, just like I used to believe in it. But I really can't see that it has any utility for the human species, and it certainly has none for the other animals.
Although psychology is defined as the science of mental processes and the behavior of an individual, researchers attempt to study human behavior by subjecting non-human animals to experimentation in laboratories. Because psychiatric illness is a human subjective experience, which is the result of social, environmental, genetic, and other factors, it is impossible to study human psychiatric illness in animals. As R. Kumar wrote in a 1974 issue of Psychological Medicine, quote, "It is not surprising that extrapolations from animal experimental data to the psychiatric clinic are closely hedged with caveats." The area of psychology where animals are most utilized in experimentation is in the behavioral sciences. Perhaps the most famous of behavioral experiments were performed by the Russian researcher Pavlov. Pavlov investigated a form of learning he called classical conditioning. In experiments with dogs, Pavlov determined how long it takes a dog to associate the sound of a buzzer with feeding time. Then, in the 1930s and 1940s, B.F. Skinner performed behavioral and learning experiments on pigeons using what came to be known as the Skinner box, which was an isolation chamber whereby the pigeon was induced by electroshock into performing various tasks. Strictly speaking, the behaviorists who dominated the field of psychology for most of the 20th century believed that the complex psychological processes of an organism can be reduced to observable, physical, experimental conditions. They thought that the behavior of animals subjected to food deprivation, loud noise, shock, and other torments in the harsh environment of a laboratory would yield to an understanding of the human mind. Perhaps the basic fallacy in this thinking is best summed up by Jonathan Friedman, professor of psychology at Columbia University, who wrote in 1975, and I quote, "It is both difficult and risky to generalize directly from the behavior of one animal to that of another. It would be a mistake to conclude that dogs act in a particular way just because cats do, or that monkeys act the same way as lions. And it is, of course, much more difficult to conclude anything about humans from other animals. It is always misleading, often foolish." Let's take a brief look at some of the basic areas of psychological research involving non-human animals. Research which every year involves the suffering of millions of animals and the waste of billions of dollars of taxpayers' money. In order to study human psychological states of depression, animal researchers induced physical and psychological trauma on animals in laboratories. Instead of studying human clinical data, researchers put mice, rats, or cats into cylinders of water from which there is no escape. They then measure how long it takes the animal to give up hope and submit to drowning. Or perhaps they use shock aversion and repeatedly shock the animal with higher and higher doses of electricity until the animal gives up and submits to the shocking. This is known as learned helplessness. Experimenters explain that these animals are experiencing, quote, abnormal behavior, or that the animals experience, quote, loss of control. Nowhere do they mention the fact that the animals are in pain and are terrified. The earliest experiments in learned helplessness were done by Martin Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania, where he electrically shocked dogs through a steel grid floor with such intensity and persistence that the dogs simply gave up and were subjected to repeated shocks. Seligman described his experiments, quote, at the onset of electric shock, the dog runs frantically about, defecating, urinating, and howling until it scrambles over the barrier and escapes from the shock. Seligman then strapped the dogs in harnesses and gave them inescapable shock. He found that, quote, a dog previously exposed to inescapable shock may take unlimited shock without escaping or avoiding at all. An original collaborator of Seligman, Stephen Mayer, has repeatedly performed learned helplessness experiments on animals. He recently wrote, quote, it would appear unlikely that learned helplessness is a model of depression in any general sense.
The learned helplessness is supposed to show something about the human condition of depression. And what was done initially, and is still being done today, as a matter of fact, is to take rats and dogs and other animals and subject them to uncontrolled shock so that the animal has no recourse but to accept that shock. There's nothing the animal can do. He cannot escape. He cannot make a response or react in any sense to stop the shocking condition. And after a while, the animal becomes completely helpless and simply stops trying to avoid it. So this has been called a learned helplessness. That is, that the animal has learned there's nothing they can do about it. And it's supposedly an analog to human depression. They can now take the animal, chop the animal up, look into the brain, see what kind of neurotransmitters are in various parts of the brain, and try to relate that to some kind of depressive condition. But that sounds
insane. It sounds like voodoo science.
Well, I consider it voodoo science, and yet during the time that I was trained at Ohio State University, where I did my graduate work, one of the better schools in the country for psychology, everyone followed what his mentor did, and so I did the same thing, obviously.
For decades, non-human animals have been injected, force-fed, and forced to inhale drugs such as barbiturates, amphetamines, LSD, heroin, alcohol, and countless others to study their effects. Often, after becoming physically addicted to these substances, the animals are abruptly withdrawn from them, causing them great pain. While under the influence of these drugs, the animal is subjected to various behavioral experiments which involve electroshock, loud noise, and other conditions which the researchers like to call, quote, aversive stimuli. An example of such research is the barbiturate experiments at Cornell University in New York involving the addiction of cats to barbiturates. For over 12 years, researchers inserted tubes into the stomachs of cats and pumped in massive quantities of barbiturates, enough to addict them. Then the barbiturates were abruptly withdrawn, and the cat's convulsions were observed and recorded. In 1988, public protests led by Trans Species Unlimited forced Cornell to stop the barbiturate experiments on cats.
Rats won't drink alcohol. They loathe alcohol. They have to be forced to drink alcohol by causing them to be dehydrated almost to the point of death.